What are some of the signs that a practitioner can look out for that might be the signs of spiritual bypassing?
Maybe three come to mind. One is a tendency to want to hang out in some kind of transcendent or awakened awareness that life is so difficult and often unfulfilling. Myriad ways in which we can try to leave that behind and just focus on our own awakening, on spiritual awakening. Or Zen has a term for it, drunk on emptiness. So that single-minded focus just on some kind of spiritual awakening. And then a second way it manifests is kind of the opposite, kind of devaluation of our own humanity, wanting to look away from it, not want to accept it or work with it. And that is usually derives from some fear of living. If the first one derives from some fear of dying, mortality, the second one is more fear of living, when that shows up. And the third one, in a way, is most interesting to me. Another way it shows up is in some kind of specialness, where you experience yourself as special in some way. You may be feel totally bad about yourself in many other ways, but here's a way that I can really feel special because of what I've learned or what I know, or more especially who I hang out with, or what community I belong to. The underlying idea being you're special, saying to a teacher or a sangha, you're special, and I'm special because I'm your student.
Mm-hmm. And if a practitioner were start to see one of these dynamics arising, this fear of dying or the fear of living or wanting to be special, is all that's needed is just an awareness of it, that it's happening, or is something more needed to address these things that can motivate one to bypass these issues?
You get a difference of opinion, I think, around the range of teachers on this, but I don't think awareness by itself is enough.
Mm-hmm.
It's not enough in therapy. Therapy clients often develop very good insight, and not a thing changes. They have the insight, the understanding, the perspective, but they can't take that next step to actually live it. There's still that next step that involves living what I know, living what I've realized, manifesting what I've realized.
So I'm wondering how you weave together this Buddhist teaching of not self and this notion of being somebody.
Nice, easy question. It's a question we often ask as we're further along in practice, but really it's a question that we ought to be thinking about from the beginning, from the get-go. I think it's important to affirm both, Both, in a way, are who we are. But even more, to see them as one, or as not different. The Mahayana would say, not different. Self and no self. It's like, I grew up on the ocean. Do you ever go to a beach and just watch the ocean? Watch the waves roll in? Well, it's all ocean, right? The ocean manifests in particular forms, which are the waves, but it's all ocean, whether it's wave or it's great body of water, it's all ocean. And the waves are no different from the ocean, or you can say it's all water. And that's finally where I think I come out and how these two weave together.
Yeah,
They're not different.
A beautiful image. And I'm hearing just within that is where the hook is that we take the waves to be more fixed than they are.
Yeah.
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 And that's the problem that Buddhism's trying to face or to address in some way. Yeah.
No, that's one of the wonderful things about watching the ocean, watching the waves come in. It becomes clear to you that very quickly that no two are exactly the same. Everyone like a snowflake, everyone is different. And yet it's all ocean.
Yeah.
And each one contributes something different to the whole. Something, a little different manifestation, but It's all manifestation of the one.
Yeah.
Buddhism never aimed its critique of the self at the psychological self, as far as I can see. The Buddha and the disciples around him seem to have very strong psychological selves. I remember a conference at Columbia University in the early days when one of his Dalai Lama's first visits here. It was an invitational conference for social scientists. And one of the professors, I think from Barnard or Columbia, wanted to start with a disclaimer. He said, I know that in Buddhism there's no such thing as a self, but, and right away His Holiness jumped in. I've heard him talk a lot. I've never heard him interrupt a student before or since like that. He jumped right in and said, no, stop. If you think there's no such thing as a self, you're going to cause a lot of suffering for yourself and others. And everybody kind of trembled for the moment because we were still, at that point, not that far away from thinking about the self as the enemy. But he was talking about the psychological self, a sense of selfhood. The Buddhist critique was aimed at the sort of ontological self, that there is no thing that one can grasp hold of, no entity, no being. That's the ontological self. That's what the Buddhist critique is aimed at. It's not. We didn't. It took us many years, I think, before we understood that.
It's such an interesting story about the Dalai Lama of. We do need to have a strong sense of self in order to do this. And that's where I hear some of the confusion is that, oh, shouldn't I be getting rid of this? And yet we find, probably in the way the Buddha was teaching, that there was some kind of strong sense of self.
Oh, yeah.
In some kind of manner.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share with us a little bit about what we mean by the word ego or ego strength.
Well, ego is one of those terms, maybe the preeminent term, that is subject to so many different meanings, and it's used in so many different contexts in spirituality and psychology. In psychology, especially clinical psychology, ego is something that you want to have, a strong sense of yourself, a strong sense of identity. It's not the same thing as the Buddhist grasping itself. It's that sense of strong identity. It has to do with having good boundaries, for instance. It has to do with the ability to tolerate unwelcome experience and maintain some equanimity. It encompasses a range of psychological strengths. And to talk about getting rid of it would make no sense to a psychologist at all. You would be getting rid of the very qualities that allow us to function and make us human. Mm-hmm. Used in a spiritual context, it's usually a pejorative with connotations of selfishness, ego-centeredness, self-centeredness. That's opposed to the goals of spiritual practice. But there's another way of thinking about ego, which I have appreciated more and more lately, in internal family systems theory. Are you familiar with that?
IFS,
Okay, IFS, yeah. Ego is a part of who we are. It's not who we are. It's not the core sense of, it's not the core self, but it's one of the many parts of us that emerges in an attempt to adapt to a difficult situation. So the core parts emerge early on in life as children try to adapt to whatever stresses there are. And over time, as a child grows up into adulthood, it becomes what's the right word for it? It's that part of us that runs the show, or tries to run the show. From an IFS perspective, there are no bad parts, right? They're all potentially helpful. They all arise in some kind of attempt at adaptation to a difficult set of circumstances. So their intent is always to help us. That's not the way we encounter them often. how do you think by doing that you're helping me? I did a lot of work with myself a few years back was anxiety in public speaking, giving talks. I would get tremendously anxious. And this part of me, which I finally discovered, would say, well, I'm making you more anxious in the hope that you'll get so anxious you'll cancel out on the talk. You won't give it, and that'll spare you looking like a fool in front of your colleagues. I said, oh, I get it. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your intentions. And I see now what your purpose is. But actually, if we look at it together, I think we'll see that that's not really been very helpful. That just makes me more anxious and more dysfunctional in other ways. So maybe we can find a way to use your skills and your intention, constructively. And that's what the practice became in working with that ego part. So that's yet a different way of thinking about it. But I find a particularly helpful way because it stresses the fact that these are all attempts at adaptation, at helping. They're not, the trouble with my trouble with some of the Buddhist way of thinking about this is you've got these 52 mental factors, these 52 citasikas. Mm-hmm. A lot of them are unskillful from a Buddhist perspective. But if you switch that around and you look at each one of them as a part with a good intention behind whatever it is they're doing and causing trouble, none of them are really kleshas in the sense that we think of that. Even greed, hatred, and delusion are all there for a purpose. They evolved to serve a certain purpose. And you can work with them that way. And if you work with them and you find out what their real intention is and real capabilities are, then you follow a kind of tantric arc where you start out with adversaries and counted first as adversaries, and working with them over time, they become helpers.